Now, why is this important? Well, the thing is that now we know how to generate more cells, but how does your body get rid of cells it doesn't need? And this is through our cells that are damaged. So sometimes your cells get damaged, which is a natural part of life, and sometimes your body during the process of building itself, it's like, we actually don't need this tissue. Or say, like, if you're like me and then you've taken an absence from the gym, your body is like, oh shoot, you haven't used these muscle cells. Let's get rid of them because you don't need to burn all these calories. So this process is called programmed cell death, or actually one of these ways your body can get rid of cells it doesn't need is this process called apoptosis. And what happens here is that notice that these cells over here, notice that they're kind of shrinking and dying off. So apoptosis, that's what's happening over here. These cells are going from normal cells, but they're dying off, and this is actually controlled. It's not just dying off at random. There's machinery in your cells that actually triggers this process. Now, why would you need this kind of process? I mean, does it make sense? You might think, why do I want my cells to die off? Well, when you're developing, you actually generate extra tissue, and this is what happens if you don't. So this is a natural process. If you have web fingers, don't worry about it, but most of us, like during regular and most normal development, we lose the webbing between our fingers. Like this is why some animals have webs between their fingers, because they don't undergo, the cells over here, they don't undergo apoptosis, but ours typically do. So maybe some people might have more additional tissue between that. So sometimes this is your body's way of getting rid of tissues it doesn't need. And the thing about apoptosis, this is another way your body gets rid of cells that are too damaged, and they might eventually replicate out of control. So what can cause cancer? Well, genetic predisposition, that means it's in your genes. Like that's about 5 to 10% of cases. But the majority of cases are due to some sort of mutations in your DNA. Now the cool thing about your cells is that they have a lot of different genes that help to kind of check the integrity of your cell's DNA and say like, hey, this cell is too damaged. Maybe we should get rid of the cell and before it has a chance to become cancerous. So the thing is that, remember, nucleic acids contain information, and what can mutations do to the information in DNA? Well, if you have a mutation in DNA, it can cause a change in mRNA. If you change the sequence of mRNA, that can change the translation and the sequence of proteins. So that's what we see with like DNA mutations. Sometimes they can cause a protein to be abnormal, or a protein that's essential to terminate before it's actually fully made. So basically it's causing some sort of alteration. And this is what can happen in cancer. So this is advanced, don't worry about this. This is the reason why I didn't include it. But things that genomics instability and mutations can cause cells to misbehave, because again, all the information and all the potential things your cells can do is encoded in your DNA. But say in DNA you have some sort of mutation that instead of a cell saying like, okay, I'm only going to grow this much and respect the borders of this tissue, it can start to divide out of control and start to invade surrounding tissues and grow to a size beyond its normal limits. So typically, if a cell gets too damaged, it undergoes apoptosis. But this is why often cancer, you have these cells that somehow turn off those other genes that help to initiate the process of apoptosis. That's why cancer develops. I know it's a little advanced, but just letting you, if you're really interested in cancer, that's what happens. Or one thing, the major drivers of cancer. And one other thing that can cause mutations is radiation. So if you have something like, one common way of causing mutations in DNA is through ultraviolet exposure. So ultraviolet light is a form of radiation. Actually, visible light is radiation. And radiation, even though it's not going to give you like burns like gamma rays, but it does have energy. So yeah, and microwaves have energy too. That's how you heat up your food. So pretty much like, or if you've just been out in the sun or just under any sort of light, infrared lights, those have energy. That's why they have those infrared, like if you've been to a restaurant where they have like the lights shining onto the food to keep it warm, that also works. ultraviolet actually has more energy than visible light. So what it can do is actually break chemical bonds. And when it does that, it can cause mutations in DNA. So when that happens, what happens? Well, if your DNA is mutated, that mutates mRNA, that mutates proteins. So gamma rays, they have even more information, and they don't just break bonds. Sometimes they can break whole molecules altogether. So this is this is why with radiation, like if you've ever had an X-ray, that's why they put on those lead vests, especially if you're trying to get like a leg X-ray. They put it over your reproductive organs because you don't want that happening to your cells that are responsible for making your ova or sperm. But the cool thing is, like, knowing that cells need DNA to replicate, the other side of it is that chemotherapy works this way. Now, when we're talking about general chemotherapy for cancer cells in general, cancer cells divide very quickly. So what's one way you can kind of like screw around with the way they divide is to actually throw chemicals that actually alter DNA. And actually, so again, when a cell divides, it actually includes the enzyme that duplicates DNA is called DNA polymerase. But this is a classic cancer drug. Don't worry about memorizing the molecular structure. But it's kind of like if you have a polymerase coming along and then encounters this little molecule in the way, it's kind of like throwing a wrench in the tracks. It's going to kind of cause that enzyme to halt, preventing it from synthesizing a new DNA molecule. And there's also things like these nucleotides. Here's uracil, here's a variant of that. So this is one example of how chemotherapy works. It kind of screws up with like different chemotherapies. For general chemotherapy, it tries to mess around with the cell cycle and different parts of the cell cycle. Ooh, good question. Why does chemo cause hair loss? So the thing is that when you lose a hair, something has to replace it, right? So your hair cells are always generating new follicles. Thing with chemotherapy, if you're interfering with the reproduction of cancer cells, you're also interfering with the reproduction of your hair cells, but not also your hair cells, other cells that are regenerating as well. So that's why chemotherapy, the thing is that it's a very kind of a blunt, or how should I put it? Cancer cells divide faster than your normal cells, so they would uptake these chemotherapeutic agents as well, but there is collateral damage because you just don't have the cancer cells. You also have your normal cells as well. So this is why you often have people who have cancer and they're undergoing chemotherapy, they have all these side effects like the nausea. That also affects the lining of your GI tract. I mean, that also affects wound healing and your immune system. Your immune system is always generating new cells. That's why it's very dangerous for them to be exposed to anything like COVID and coronavirus, because by chemotherapy targeting normal dividing cells, that also lowers their count of immune cells as well. Yeah, so if you get a cut or injury with chemo, then you can't heal. Yeah, so it will slow down the healing process.